You are listening to The Last Fireflies, a radical climate podcast bringing you discussions of climate science and activism from all around Europe. Hey folks, welcome back to the show. Today we have another Infospill segment hosted by me, Robi, and I'm joined by Ani today.
Hi everyone.
And we are continuing our discussion about tipping points and the Hothouse Earth state. It's really useful if you got to listen to the last episode about tipping points. So if you did not do that, maybe go do that now. But also you can listen to it independently. But you can do what you like. We are not your bosses.
And if you heard the last episode, you will know that today we are in Valley B.
Yes, today we are exploring what happens in Valley B, exactly. Yeah. Okay, last time we discussed about the idea of tipping points. Again, just to summarize, there are some elements of the Earth system, like the Greenland ice sheet and the Amazon rainforest, or the currents in the North Atlantic, which, if the Earth warms up to a certain threshold limit, then those elements start to behave in a so-called self-sustained way, meaning after that, even if you stop all emissions, they will continue to do what they want to do, meaning the ice sheets will melt, the Amazon rainforest will transform into a savanna, and the so-called AMOC, the ocean currents in the Atlantic, they will collapse and rearrange. And what we explored together, based on a paper, is like exactly what is our best estimate of the temperatures, thresholds at which they happen. And we noted that around 1.5 degrees warming, which is like close to where we are today, or where we are going to be in a few years, we have a likely activation of the Greenland ice sheet. So that will melt in a few hundred years, maybe 1,000 years. At this point, it seems inevitable. The same with the West Antarctic ice sheet. And as we are projected to go to 2.5, 3 degrees, somewhere in that range, it will be expected that likely the AMOC collapse will be initiated, and also the collapse of the Amazon rainforest, and maybe even catastrophic collapse or melting of the permafrost, which is like the frozen ground at the north around the Arctic Circle. Right, so we ended the last discussion with the idea that all of these elements, they are not independent, right? Scientists often study them, like what happens if everything stays the same, but just the Greenland ice sheet melts or just the AMOC collapses. But in reality, they are not independent. So the melting of the Greenland ice sheet affects the AMOC. It makes it more unstable.
Yeah, it's an interdependent systems.
Yeah, they are interdependent systems. And if one of them is triggered, it makes the other one to which it's connected to, or the other ones, it makes them easier to tip, right? It lowers the threshold.
Yeah, or to activate.
To activate, yeah, exactly. So we ended the discussion with kind of a what is the right word for it?
Grim.
A kind of a grim, I use this word a lot, grim. I think I read it in this book, Hothouse Earth. It's called. I recommend it. It's a good book. It's quite accessible, and the author used this term grim. I think it stayed with me. So yeah, we ended last time with a grim. Well, it's not a prediction, but like a grim possibility that it's possible that if several of these tipping points are activated, which is likely in the 2-3 degrees world, then we can kind of activate a global tipping point for the whole climate, which makes the Earth irreversibly start to transition into different state, a hothouse Earth state, the Valley B, as I said in the other episode.
Mm-hmm. Like the depth of that valley.
Yeah, exactly. So the bottom of the valley.
And you're trapped there. Like the ball will not flow anymore.
Exactly, yeah.
Like practically the idea of it is that anything we might do will not change that for sure.
Yeah.
So like it's really out of our human's power, even if it's in the human power towards that or not towards that.
Exactly, yeah. And you could imagine in principle, like with example with the ball, that you have something that pushes it back, but that would mean we would need to have some kind of carbon capture on a scale that is really unimaginable. Like it's a technology which is not even tested at large scale, but even if it would be tested, like we would need that at a scale that is really unimaginable. Like as much is our output from the global economy of CO2, that much we would need to absorb each year if you would want to reverse this process. So I think it's really, for practical purposes, we can think of it as irreversible once we are on that trajectory. Yeah. So that's why, as I said, it's important to act now to avoid that future, because we are still not on it, or at least we are not sure if we are on it or not.
Yeah, I think it's better prevention, because intervention is so little to capacities for the scale of the challenge that might bring us. And challenge is a really soft for this case. So yeah, prevention, I think it's the way for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that for every problem, the prevention is so much easier and takes so much less resources than the management of a crisis. Like the scale of resources you need to manage a crisis is much higher, much larger than what you need to do prevention. That's a good point, I think, also for the climate. Okay, so let's explore a bit what this Hothouse Earth state means. So I guess for that, I was thinking that we need to look a bit into the deep past of the Earth. So we have some figures which will be attached in the description of the episode. It shows the evolution of the Earth's temperature over the past 500 million years. Like this is roughly the period when complex life started to appear. The Cambrian explosion happened 500-something, 60 million years ago. Maybe you know about that, when the complexity of life, exploded. And if you look at different papers, there are different figures for this temperature, just because as we go further back in time, it's harder to get accurate data. So first of all, we cannot go back in time with the time machine and measure the temperature, right? And so we need some kind of indirect way of measuring it. And the longer we go back in the past, there are less and less methods that can go back so far. So the uncertainties are higher. But even with that in mind, there are some things that we can tell. So if you look at the figure, we can see that in general, like in very broad strokes, Earth's climate has kind of oscillated between warm phases and cool phases. So warm phases are periods when Earth's average temperature is like 10, 15 degrees higher than in the present. And cold phases are something like what we have in the present. So Earth in the present is in a cold phase. The warm phases are sometimes called greenhouse states or hothouse states, while the cold phases are sometimes called cool house or ice house. You will see different names for these states. And the idea is kind of that it's not like Earth can have any kind of temperature, right? It has a kind of very relatively stable state in the warm region, right? Although, of course, temperatures from one period to the other are not exactly the same. But in general, like it tends to be stable around the warmer threshold somewhere. And it also tends to be stable somewhere in the cool house periods. And in between that, we have some kind of transitional periods. Of course, it doesn't jump from one place to the other, but it doesn't tend to stay a lot in the intermediate zone. So over time, it passes. You can imagine the evolution is kind of a switching between the cool phase and the hot phase.
Anyway, in a smooth way, no?
Yeah, in a smooth way, of course. And anyway, we are talking about millions of years, so we don't have a perception of these long time scales, right? So if you would be living in that time, you would not see this kind of fast transitions or anything. But if you have this kind of long view, then we see this switching between these states. And the reason for this is interesting. I will make a detour. It's not necessarily short, but I think it's interesting. Like, why does the temperature change so much in these long time scales? So bear with me. There are a few different factors that drive these changes, and most of them have to do with CO2. So those are the major way that CO2 is absorbed from the atmosphere is through the so-called weathering of rocks. I know that for most of you it will be the first time you hear about this, but it's kind of a similar process to how metals rust. So if you expose a piece of iron to air, because air has moisture and it has oxygen, it tends to oxidize and become rust. So the iron is captured by the oxygen, it forms iron oxide, which is like a crumbly material, it becomes dust. So that is the rust. So, and there is a very similar process that happens for rocks, like rocks meaning mountains. When mountains are exposed to the air, their surface tends to, well, quote unquote, rust, and the substances within the rocks, within the minerals, are extracted or dislodged from the rock. And the products of that rusting, of that weathering of the rocks, then will be washed away by rain and carried by rivers out to the sea, to the oceans, where it's deposited on the bottom of the ocean. And over very long time scales, it gets sedimented there, and the bottom of the ocean gets reabsorbed into the mantle of the earth. So it's maybe a surprising way that CO2 is absorbed, but that's the main driver of the decline of CO2, of the absorption of CO2 over these long hundreds of million years time scales. Maybe some scientists will be angry with me of simplifying it so much. It has to do with calcium and magnesium ions and whatever. But in a nutshell, is rocks that are exposed to air, they rust, and the products are washed out to the ocean and deposited there. And this process leads to a net drawing of CO2 from the air. So if there would be no other factors that come into play, it would mean that over time, CO2 would continue to decline and decline and decline. And most scientists believe that if you project into the future for hundreds of millions of years, this process would continue of CO2 decline, surprisingly, I guess, for many people. So the main factor that counteracts this is volcanic activity. When a volcano explodes, it releases a large amount of CO2 into the atmosphere. And again, maybe surprisingly, volcanoes are the main factor that pumps CO2 into the air over this long time span. And the way you would imagine that CO2 varies in the atmosphere is that it continuously declines, and then when there's a strong volcanic activity, it starts to rise, right? And so you have these kind of cycles, and that's exactly what you see. And because CO2 is strongly intercoupled with temperature, right, then the temperature also has these kind of cycles of moving, cooling, warming. That's basically it. Surprisingly, rusting of rocks, and volcanic activity, those are the two processes that mostly influence the evolution of temperature. It's kind of interesting that this weathering of rocks happens also mechanically, like you have some cracks in the rocks, water gets in, and as it freezes, it pushes out the rocks and more cracks form. And so there's more rusting that can happen. But also plants and fungi, as they infiltrate their roots and their mycelia into the cracks of the rocks, they also break rocks apart. And actually, the appearance of plants on land and of fungi, I think like 400-something million years ago, that contributed, first of all, to the appearance of soil, right? They broke down the rocks and they created soil. But they also produced this weathering effect. So you had a very quick decline of CO2 during this period. So the main factors that accelerate the weathering are the appearance of plants. And the other effect is, as you probably know, continents tend to move around in time. And when continents break apart, that's a moment when usually you have high volcanic activity. And when continents smash into each other, like you had with India smashed into Asia, forming the Himalayas, that's a moment when more rock is exposed to the air, and you have this very quick weathering. So the appearance of plants and the movement of continents are really the two drivers of these changes. Right. So I said these factors. There are two other factors which are worth mentioning. One is that over time, the sun tends to get a little bit brighter. Like in 100 million years, it gets 1% brighter or something like that. It's not a large effect, but it matters on long time scales. As CO2 declines, it tends to cool. And the sun getting brighter counteracts that effect. And the last one that is worth mentioning is human activity. The emission of CO2 due to burning of fossil fuels. It's really very similar to how volcanoes pump CO2 into the atmosphere. So what we are doing today is comparable to these other major factors.
It is impressive that the Earth has these systems that can stay kind of in an equilibrium over time, but also the change that it brings is not like the temperature is changing overnight from a day to another. It's just like it's a soft way to stay in equilibrium even if there are changes, but the changes are not so drastic. But since humans started to have the same effect, it became not so much an equilibrium anymore, no?
Yeah, if you take this broad view, then changes may seem fast, but as you said, they are relatively smooth. And it's amazing in a way that humans can have this big impact. As I have mentioned before in other episodes, today, the speed at which we pump CO2 in the atmosphere is 100 times faster than at any time during this 500 million year period, right? It's faster than at any time in Earth's history. And it's amazing that we can do that, but it's also like we are heading towards something completely unknown. And so we should be scared if we continue going like this.
It's interesting. Now that I'm thinking about the examples that you gave with what actually creates these changes in a natural way, like weathering of rocks and the volcanoes, and thinking about the plants. You said that CO2 emissions of human activity from burning fossil fuels are behaving kind of like volcano. One of another big activity of humans that are actually impacting the Earth systems, and it's one of the characteristics of the Anthropocene, is the large-scale land use changes like deforestation, massive urbanization. And this really counteracts the plant system that you just described. The plants were the ones that were cooling down the systems. And practically in the moment in which we take up that land, we don't let the plants do their job. We invade on large scale the land, and we use it in our own ways with chemicals and lights and all that. We are actually also cutting down the system that helps planet by itself to cool down. So we warm it in two ways now.
Yeah, in many more than two ways. Plants help absorb CO2 in many ways, like in these long time scales, because they break down rocks, right? Through this weathering effect, deposit CO2 into the bottom of the ocean, but also like they use CO2 to build their bodies, their plant mass, and some of that is then stored in the ground. So plants and animals, right, together with bacteria and fungi, they also store carbon in the soil long term, or it can be long term, right? But what's happening now is, as you said, through deforestation, the CO2 that's locked into the bodies of the plants, of the trees, that's released. And also because of the changes that we are doing, the soil can hold less CO2. And also because we had so much warming already, many of the forests and other biodiverse ecosystems are starting to emit more CO2 than they are absorbing. So, for example, recent studies have shown that the Amazon, which we usually think that it captures CO2, right? Now the Amazon has started turning into a net source of CO2. It emits more than it captures. And also some other forests closer to the Arctic Circle, again, are showing signs that they are starting to become net sources of CO2. So those are many more ways that we are making CO2 increase in the atmosphere, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly why when people tell us like, oh, but the Earth was cold before, or some people that are more into these studies than me, I heard it's not the first time when the planet is warming so much and so on, but like, it's not only that the planet is warming, it's not warming by itself. If we continue in this rhythm, we will have a planet that will not stabilize itself at all. We just disrupt the systems that the Earth has to stay in this smooth equilibrium that we were talking about over the like millennia of years, if we look back in time.
The way you said it, that the climate or the Earth system's parts will not stabilize at all, like over long term. There's a scenario like it's called the Venus runaway effect. The Earth would turn into Venus, which has temperature of like 500 degrees, and it's really a hell. But really, generally, it's considered that the Earth could not have that kind of runaway greenhouse effect for several reasons, but I think the ocean is one reason. It has a big ocean, and it prevents that kind of runaway effect. A few decades ago, people thought that maybe that was a real risk. Now we think that it's not a risk to have really that kind of worst-case scenario. However, what could happen is that the emissions that we have, they trigger many tipping points, and they together push the Earth towards this kind of warm phase. And the warm phase, as I said, is like 10 degrees warmer than we have in the present. And that's, maybe not all of life will disappear, but certainly human societies will not be able to survive that. And that's a time when you had temperate forests on Antarctica, and you had crocodiles above the Arctic Circle, right, in Greenland or whatever. You have temperatures like in Central, like in Southern Europe. You had that in Northern Canada and right Siberia. I'm not sure exactly how this part of the world looked like, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. It was definitely much hotter and much wetter. Very likely it was uninhabitable for humans continuously, because at least during summer, if you have temperatures which are so hot that humans cannot survive it, then this area cannot be lived by humans continuously, right? And so that's what we are talking about. That is the risk that we are facing if we go in this Hothouse Earth trajectory. Of course, it will not reach it by the end of the century, right? But it would be a fate, a future that will be locked in. And basically we are condemning our grandchildren, but not even grandchildren, because it would take maybe a few hundred years to fully reach the 10 degrees warming, right? But by the end of the century, we would have maybe 3, 4, 5 degrees. We don't know exactly, which would be already catastrophic.
But when you say 10 degrees is a medium, like an average, in our lifetime, we can already see some places where we live that are actually changing the temperatures over the summer dramatically. And we already see this.
Yeah, that's kind of the fallacy or the mirage that happens when we talk only about averages, right? I think I've mentioned this before, like 2 degrees or like maybe 3 degrees warming in average. That means that some places will have 8 degrees or 10 degrees already warming with this average of 3 degrees, right? Mm-hmm. So regional effects are much, much higher. I think there were some studies recently that said that with 4 degrees warming until the end of the century, on average, that would translate into a warming of 8 or 10 degrees in the north of Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, that place, right? So it would make those places borderline uninhabitable. Even this 3-4 degrees, which is looking more and more likely that we will have. So, of course, regional effects are much, much more severe than the average would let us think.
And in these scenarios, it's not only about temperature, no? There are also these catastrophic events that can be more often more dangerous, like floods and hurricanes and desertification of some regions.
Yeah.
It's not only about strictly how hot it is the summer, just to not give the impression that that's the only concern. It's a really complex system. And as you say, we are paving the way for a locked-in futures. And we can pave the way for another future that is actually better, but it's still a choice.
Yeah, I think I've heard Bill McKibben, who's like a legendary journalist who's been working on climate change since the 80s, I think. I've heard him say this statistic. I don't know from what study it comes from. I haven't researched it, but he says like every 0.1 degrees of warming in the future will mean that an area inhabited by 100 million people will switch between very warm to dangerous to human health, right? So every 0.1 degrees. And so even small victories will matter a lot. It means a difference of 0.3 degrees or 1 degree. Like if you have 2 or 3 degrees warming, it would mean the difference between 1 million people being able to continue to live and work in their homes, in the places they live. So even these relatively small changes have a big impact. And so if you would think in the future of 4 degrees, 5 degrees, this is like really unimaginable. We are talking about collapse of human civilization, really. It's not an exaggeration. And, let's not think only about humans. We've discussed this in the last episode with Andrei, that animals can adapt to pretty high changes in temperature by just moving around. It gets warmer, they move further north where it's cooler, right? But you need time for species to relocate, and even slower species, for example, trees, you need a lot of time to be able to migrate, right? And so the speed at which the changes happen matters. And this is really the concerning statistic, again, that we are warming the planet 100 times faster than at any time in its history, even 100 times faster than during the great extinctions. There were a few extinctions in Earth's history where 70-80% of all life disappeared. And now we are warming the planet 100 times faster. The extinction rate of species is 1,000 times faster than natural values would be, and comparable and probably higher than it happened during the great extinctions. So humans may survive this warming, but most of the life on Earth will disappear in this Hothouse Earth scenario. And so we are really facing like an existential moment. Like people who say that climate alarmists are exaggerating or whatever. No, it's not. We are really facing an existential moment for human civilization and, for life on Earth, right? It will not disappear, but most might become extinct. And this will play out on long time scales, right? Hundreds, maybe thousands of years. But it is a direct consequence of our actions now. And that is the, in a way, also scary part, that what we do now will have these consequences. But again, for me, it also calls on me to dedicate my life to this issue. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very tough to hear all at once and to also hold it. And I think it's also something that we already see. So just pointing out towards what's obvious, maybe it shouldn't be the alarmist phase, is more like the consciousness phase, maybe. But you were saying, that all these species has to adapt, and they usually migrate, and they are really good adapters. We humans do the same, no? Like we want to adapt and migrate, but we have borders and politicians and militarization and all that actually will put even more pressure on actually us existing further. So we are also like really digging our own hole here if we continue in this capitalist, militaristic, climate change driver society. So it's very understandable that the new generation came with Fridays for Futures and they don't see their future. And I think it's really good to hear that loud noise of crisis, and even when it's hard to hold it all at once. Yeah, that's why we are also trying to give some offerings at the end and try to process our emotions, but not giving up the struggle. Because, that's what the society we live in requires.
Yeah. And just to repeat this point, when we say we, or we as humanity, of course, it's not a collective we, which, are the cause and who will bear the consequences of climate change, right? Because most of the emissions come from the global north, plus China and India. But the places that will experience the highest consequences, the highest temperature rise, the highest increases in floods, in famines, in droughts, are also people who live in countries which have contributed the least to the climate crisis and who live in the global south, right? And it's doubly perverse that the global north is trying to build a wall and to keep people from the global south out, right? It's like you destroy their livelihoods and then you make them live and die there, suffer and die there. It's inhumane. It just shows what kind of almost psychopathic nature this kind of global capitalist, also economic system, but also the mindset of people who are supporting the system, right? And again, I think we need to call out that those people are our enemies who are upholding this global capitalist, colonialist, imperialist system. But let's try to make a summary. But again, the idea is that Earth's climate has, during the last 500 years, has switched back and forth between warm and cool phases. Cool phases are periods when there were ice sheets and stuff like that, and temperatures were cooler, similar to today. Warm phases were periods with no ice on the planet and temperatures like 10, 15 degrees higher than today. And yeah, we are in an ice house or cool house state. And because of the CO2 emissions that we are producing and the temperature rise that we are causing, several different tipping elements might be activated, and that might push the Earth out of this cool house state towards a warm phase, a Hothouse Earth phase. And that's really a future that is very, very grim, with collapse of human societies and extinction of a large percent of the plants and animals and fungi that live on the Earth. So that is the future that we face. Those are the choices that we face, right? Because in the present, we are really at that critical junction. In the example, we are close to the peak of the mountain. In the example with the balls and the valleys, we are close to the peak of the mountain, and it's really our choice if we push the ball further, or rather allow politicians and fossil fuel companies to push us beyond the peak, right? Which would lead to this runaway trajectory towards the Hothouse Earth state.
Wow, that was a lot and very important section for the Infospill. Thank you very much, Robi, for all this, even if it's so hard to hear it all at once. And that's why we usually follow up the Infospill with a bit of an offering from our side. So we will let you now with M to bring you some really beautiful verses.
This is a fully listener-supported podcast, and with the price of one coffee or a beer each month, you can help us continue this work by subscribing to our Patreon.
Hi, I'm M, and today's offering is a poem. A few years ago, I had this pretty amazing experience of being a co-editor for a queer literary anthology in Romania called Luminișuri, Antologie de literatură queer ecologică, which I would translate like Glades, a queer ecological anthology. We were doing this as part of Cenaclul X, a queer autonomous literary circle. And in a literary circle, we kept meeting and reading out our poems and our writings. And it really emerged that there was this interest and this deep curiosity and concern to write about the environment and the climate crisis. So we proposed to sort of self-organize as a group and do this anthology. And I really learned so much by working with the co-editors Nora Ugron, Corina Preda, and Ceza Bularca. So today, when we are talking about Hothouse Earth, I couldn't help but think of one specific poem in this anthology. It's a poem that's pretty long, it has many parts, and it's called Queer Ecologies by Ceza Bularca. I will read out only one part in translation by myself. Ecology 2. The train starts off nervously, but soon we no longer feel the movement, numb from the swinging and the heat, the darkness, and the hothouse. In the carriage, there was coughing and a lot of dust. We both think of that, although when we see each other, we don't say that. We smile, and you beam at me when I tell you that you are the best dressed person in any room I've ever been. The pink sandals sparkled in the flash of my phone, my curious face searching for you among the doors of the sleeping car. We cough and see the burnt light outside, the dry earth. The night will cover them carefully, and we will not fall asleep. We will keep watch over all those who die before our eyes in the hothouse world, when there is nothing else you can do. To witness the death of others is a duty. You want to dream of fairy tales in which we are free, fairy tales in which we run to the horizon and break the hothouse, fairy tales in which the air that enters heals our wounds, which we don't talk about when we smile at each other. You tell me about the deer, roe, reindeer, elk, about lakes where we must bathe our bodies to free them. You tell me about the crocodile that will protect us from real estate business. We think of call me by your name, so you called me anarchy, and I called you communism, and I call you communism, and you call me anarchy. We look out the window. I only think of the possibility of seeing the deer, roe, reindeer, elk you told me about, at least for a second, so we can figure out the direction, to jump off the train and run towards them. Even if they did appear, we wouldn't see anything in the darkness beyond the window. The neon lights reflect us back at ourselves. After many fairy tales, you close the book with synthetic green neon leather and pink glitter clip-on, from which we read the fairy tales of liberation, and you tell me that maybe we should invent the story of our own freedom. Maybe there's no way back. Maybe the earth is too barren and the world too much a hothouse, the cough too dry, but maybe for the time we have left we can be what the world wasn't for us. You called me empathy. I called you veganism. You called me solidarity. I called you community. You called me non-binarity. I called you justice. You called me care. I called you revolt. You called me resistance. And we called ourselves revolution. Startled by a loud noise, we watch colorful explosions in the sky. We softly let ourselves fall into the train that has been moving forward in the darkness for some time without asking ourselves where we are, without asking ourselves for how long. And we called ourselves a communion of worlds.
That's all for today. If you would like to support us, you can do that by interacting with and sharing our episodes on social media and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Or for those of you who would like to help us financially also, you can do that by subscribing to our Patreon or with a one-time donation through Ko-fi. As you know, there has been a quite severe legal crackdown on climate groups all around Europe in recent years, coupled with the rise of the far right in many countries who are very fossil fuel friendly. It's becoming quite difficult to do climate activism, especially in countries like Romania, where the movement is very small and hasn't reached a critical mass yet. So with that in mind, first of all, we would hope for this project to reach a stage where we can cover a part-time income for some of our members who are involved in the climate movement here. And after a certain threshold is reached, we would like also to redistribute this money to other groups and individuals doing important work on climate here in Romania and in the broadly defined Eastern Europe and the Balkans. So even a $2 subscription would mean a lot to us. Well, that was our show. Until next time, take care, be kind to each other, but also organize to fight back.